Hello and welcome. I am Lisa Solomon. I'm with Common Sense, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this important parenting discussion that we're having about the impact of technology and how it is helping or potentially hindering our kids as they build relationships and friendships in the world. I want to give a special shout out to the many school communities joining us from across the country who support our nonprofit work and all that we do. We are so grateful for your partnership. Before we jump in, I just have a few housekeeping items to get us on our way for this important discussion. The panel will speak for about 50 minutes. We'll do our best to answer questions along the way, but please know that our team has read all of the great questions that many of you submitted ahead of time, and many of those have informed our upcoming conversation. But if you are joining us live, I encourage you to pop comments and possibly new questions if you're so inspired into the chat. We will be monitoring the chat in real time, and we're also going to be adding resources for your benefit. So keep an eye on that as well. We are recording this conversation, so it will be available to watch later if you need to jump off or if you get busy. Don't worry, we'll send that link to you later so you can watch it in your own time. I want to quickly just start by setting the scene as to why we picked this topic. Common Sense regularly conducts best laid plans. Common Sense regularly conducts independent research on media and tech use and how it impacts children. And so much of our research underpins all that we do at our nonprofit. So our discussion tonight is looking at ways to help our kids build relationships off and online. And our latest research report, which was just released in December, focused on how tweens and teens have relied on media during the pandemic to do many things. One, to potentially boost their moods, to connect with friends and family, and even to learn how to do new things outside of school, like crocheting or building computers. There's a whole list that we have on the research that you can take a look at. We will share the link to the full research report so you can review the methodology and the specifics. But there's another finding that I wanted to highlight to help set the table for today's conversation. And it's encouraging for all of us parents and caregivers, if you're tired of telling our kids or your kids to turn off those screens. The encouraging finding is that despite how engaging media has been during this very crazy and challenging time, most tweens and teens are actually ready to get back to in-person socializing. And they actually want to spend even more time with their friends in person than they did before the pandemic started. So to help put all this in context and to parse these on and offline worlds, we'll be joined soon by three really insightful teens who are going to share their perspectives. But first, I am so very lucky to introduce these two women joining us who will be sharing their advice and guiding the conversation. The first is Dr. Cara Natterson. She's a pediatrician. She's best-selling author of the Care and Keeping of You series, which I know I have on my bookshelf, and Guy Stuff. And she's also co-founder of a puberty company called OOMLA, OOMLA. And we also have Dr. Lisa Damour. She's a psychologist, best-selling author of Untangled and Under Pressure. And all these books I also have on my bookshelf as well. And she's a New York Times columnist. And she also has a podcast that I know many of you listen to regularly. So Cara, I'm going to first hand this over to you to give us just an overview of where our teens and tweens are coming from, perhaps from just a physiological standpoint. Cara?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Common Sense. Thrilled to be here with the other Lisa. So, just a couple of minutes on where the kids who were studied by Common Sense are in their maturation, basically. So 8 to 18-year-olds, that was the group that was looked at in the study that Lisa referenced that came out in December. 8 to 18-year-olds are tweens and teens. Tweens are 8 to 12, teens are 13 to 18, and they are all in puberty. So what does that mean? That means that they have hormones, chemical messengers that are coursing through their bloodstream. And those chemical messengers are telling their bodies to change. And then when their bodies start shifting, those same chemical messengers go up and circulate around their brain. And they're telling their brains how to respond and how to feel. And we all know this. This is very familiar to us because we have all experienced this, right? At the same time that physical shifts are happening, there also is a whole sort of path through brain development where the brain is starting to mature. And what's happening there is that the brain cells and the neurons are being myelinated. They're being covered with a little insulation that's going to help them send messages much faster and more efficiently among themselves and between themselves. So all of these shifts and changes are happening. But between 8 and 18, what you have is sort of a stew, right? You have hormones in the brain that are impacting the way the neurons act. And the neurons are firing really, really quickly to certain parts of the brain, namely the emotional part of the brain, the limbic system, but not quite as quickly to the more thoughtful, rational planning part of the brain, right? The prefrontal cortex. And it's just a matter of timing, how these things order up. And so you have kids who are starting puberty, yes, at 8 and 9 is normal now, and whose brains are in the midst of developing. And all of that is stretching through this time period that we call adolescence. The one other thing I'll add is that what is developmentally normal at this period, and Lisa will probably get into this a little bit, is trying on all sorts of different personas and attitudes and clothing styles. And, you know, this is what the teen years are all about. And it's not just coincidental that it's happening at the same time as brain maturation and puberty. It's happening that way for a reason. And so because these things are braiding together and coming together, we have to consider them together. But what we also had over the past 2 years was a pandemic that shifted everything about the way kids experience these very profound changes. And so we will talk in this hour about how being separated from one another shifted the experience of bonding to one another. Mm-hmm. But I will just leave it at the following comment, that before kids kind of retreated into their homes and locked down and did the right thing, some of them had started to transform physically and emotionally. Others had not. And some came out of that period of time fully transformed, and others did not. And I think we need to layer that into the conversation. So Lisa, do you want to now take over and talk a little bit about the psychological overview of where kids are?
Sure. I love that. I love that description. And it's a wonderful sort of meshing with sort of like, here's the brain side, so then I'll do the mind side of this. So what we know at this point in development normally is that kids are loosening their ties to their families and strengthening their ties to their peers. This is what we expect to happen over the course of adolescence. It's what kids do very naturally. As they age, they just want to spend more and more time with their friends and less time with their folks. And this in many ways sort of midwifes them out the door into their more independent young adulthood. Obviously, COVID halted that process. And one of the things that is so strange, and I know, you've got two teenagers, I've got a young teenager and an older teenager. As families, we spend so much time together with our teenagers in a way that we would never under normal conditions have been together as much as we have been. Wonderful in many ways, but very hard on young people, to be sure. So obviously, young people relied very heavily on social media when they could not leave their homes, could not see one another. And for the most part, I felt, and I think, Cara, you felt like, thank goodness for social media. Can you only imagine how awful this pandemic would have been when we were teenagers and had no way besides fighting for the family phone to try to be in touch with our peers? So by and large, very grateful for the connections that young people were able to maintain digitally. But what I saw clinically, and I know you saw, is that a lot of kids started to look quite depressed. That parents would call me and they would describe how their teenager was doing. And it really sounded like the diagnostic criteria of depression were being described to me. And there was a juncture where some students could start to go back to school and they had options about going back to school or not. And the family wasn't sure if they should or if they could. And I would say to them, is there any way your son or daughter can go back to school? And they would say yes. And I'd say, why don't you give it a shot? I said, right now, I'm going to diagnose your teenager with pandemic-itis. Send them back to school for a week to 10 days and then call me back. And I have to tell you, Cara, every one of those, the depression remitted, the symptoms remitted as soon as they could be in the company of their peers. That there was something absolutely immediately salutary, immediately magical about just getting to be in the company of the peers they love so much. So social media helped a lot, but it wasn't the same as the being together. Now the kids are able to be back together, which is wonderful. I am so happy that we are finally there. And I think continuing to move in that direction. There are a few things we're seeing. One is FOMO at a different form, which is saying yes to everything. And I am hearing of introverted kids. I know introverted kids who are, as soon as they were able to connect again, were getting together constantly, exhausting themselves with it. But that sense of having missed out on so much made it really hard to turn down any opportunity to be together. So I think we've had a lot of very tired teenagers as they are understandably trying to make up for lost social time. The other thing I am seeing among teenagers in school is that they are, and this is a heavy-handed word, but I will say it, terrified that schools are going to be shut down again. And one thing I have observed, and I'm hearing about it from my colleagues at other schools, is that teenagers, most of them are being, in many ways, what I would say, over-compliant, being buttoned up and extremely well-behaved, not having any of the kind of juice and friction that you normally see with adolescents, out of a fear that if they step a toe out of line, this will somehow disrupt their ability to be back together. And I have to tell you, as someone who spends time at schools, it's not what I like teenagers to be like. Like, they should be pushing, playing, and it's not been as just as rich with adolescent behavior as I would like to see it. The other thing we're seeing, and this has ramifications for their social landscapes, there are a lot of kids who are in distress who are managing their distress by acting out. We have seen much more acting out behavior in schools, in middle schools and high schools. And this is kids who are suffering. This is kids who are expressing their distress by getting themselves in trouble. It's very hard on them. It's also hard on the kids around them. So what I will say is we're coming back together. There's a lot of trying to make up for lost time. There's a lot of let's not blow it. Let's not go backwards. And there's also a lot of, wow, some of my classmates are bringing a lot of spice to school in a way that makes the day hard and long. So that's what I'm seeing. And I'm trusting and hoping it will smooth out over time. But boy, have these young people really been through something that we could never have fathomed. And they've handled it with vastly more grace than certainly I think I would have ever. Okay, so let's bring them in. We have absolutely fantastic teenagers with us. I'm going to introduce them as we go. So here we have Hannah, who, like me, lives in Cleveland. So we are representing the Midwest on this very, very cold night in Cleveland. It's like maybe 11 degrees outside. So we are well bundled up here. And then we have, and Hannah's a student at St. Joseph Academy here in Cleveland. We have Nola, who's a 10th grader at Dalton in New York City. I hope it's not as cold there as it is here. And then we have Caleb, who is a 12th grader at Crossroads School in LA, where it's probably not 11 degrees. So we are thrilled to have you with us. And I'm actually going to start with a couple questions. And I'm going to lay out a couple questions. And then, Hannah, why don't you kick us off in terms of your thoughts about these questions? Okay. So here are my questions. How did quarantine change your usage of social media and your need for social media? And did your feelings about social media change while you were in lockdown?
Oh, I think that's a good question. I think during lockdown, I think not only sparked a lot of time for all of us, and I think that opened a lot of ways for like wonderment and a lot of ways to question really like the world around you. And I think it allows this anybody who's given enough time to just look back on what you're doing every day and kind of seeing like the value in that and kind of seeing what can I do better? How are things going in the world? And I think it just kind of makes you wonder. And yeah, I think social media was a very good outlet for that, for sure.
Wonderful. Caleb, why don't you chime in here?
Sure. My usage of social media completely spiked during pandemic. I mean, it really was kind of my saving grace, my lifeline during the pandemic, because it helped me connect with all my peers. It allowed me to do research and learn about what was going on and FaceTime with friends. And I remember having Zoom parties with friends when I couldn't go out and stuff like that. And then at the same time, when I would see some of my friends hanging out or doing things, breaking quarantine rules or stuff like that, it also caused me, on the flip side, to get that feeling of FOMO and kind of reevaluate some things. So social media was both an incredible outlet for me during the pandemic, and it also led to some deep feelings as well.
Nola.
I think that as I spent more time in quarantine, I also spent more time on my phone. And although it did help me kind of discover a lot of interests that I have now, like knitting, I saw, YouTube videos about it in quarantine, and I kind of got kind of this passion for it. I also think that spending more time inside and on my phone kind of made me realize social media is sometimes a very toxic place. And when I spent, maybe a couple minutes in the afternoon after school, I only had, a limited time to scroll around and kind of, just catch up on, what's happening on the daily. But with Zoom school, I would be spending like every single 5-minute break I have between classes kind of looking through social media. And so a lot of more stuff got, thrown at me. And so it kind of made me realize that the longer I am on social media and the more time I have to spend on social media, the more you realize it sometimes can be a toxic place. So I think that although it did help me in terms of the pandemic, and social media helped me kind of like reach out to my friends, and we would be like, again, having like Zoom parties, and I would be talking to my friends. There's also kind of a flip side. And the flip side is that more time on social media is being more exposed to, kind of terrible stuff. So I think that, it went both ways for me, at least.
Okay, so let's rewind for a minute. You're all in high school. I want to turn the clock back and think about when you first either got your own device or had pretty broad access to a device in your home. And I want to tee this up. This is obviously pre-pandemic, right? But people have written in with questions, and one of the questions is, at what age did you start to feel social pressure about having either a device or a login onto a platform? And looking back, do you wish that you had access to certain platforms or certain devices sooner? Do you wish that they had been restricted more? And then, I'd love to layer on there. Then you went through a pandemic. How did that change your feeling about it? So how might your answer be different today than it might have been if the same you at the same age was answering a couple of years ago, if that makes sense? And Caleb, I am going to start with you, and I just want to do a quick shout out. It is Caleb's 18th birthday, so happy birthday, Caleb. And you're with us.
This is a phenomenal question. I got an iPod in 3rd grade, and I got my first phone in 5th grade. And I know for me, I was pressuring my parents for months to get me a phone. I mean, I was like, can I please get a phone? And then when it was my birthday, I was like, can I please have a phone? And it was like, no. And so I think at the time I was thrilled when I got a phone, because it allowed me to chat with some friends and stay in touch with people going into 6th grade when I went to a new school. And then on the flip side of that, it exposed me to social media and to the internet and to texting and learning my own responsibilities with my own device in 5th grade. And so I'm not 100% positive if I would change when I got my device, but I think definitely more restrictions would have been nice, so I could have gone through those lessons with other people and not just kind of figure out what to send and what not to send by myself in 5th grade.
And then post-pandemic, have you restricted yourself more? Or have you, do you think that's a function of your age, a function of having been on screens for 2 years straight, or are you just on it the same?
Yeah, I definitely try to be on it less now that I can see more people in person, because I definitely prefer in-person interactions 100% over being on my screen. So I'm definitely on it less. And I think being in the pandemic has helped me learn and set boundaries with social media. Like Nola was saying about how social media can be a toxic place, and to kind of separate myself and set boundaries with it.
All right, Nola, jump in. What's your history? What's your experience?
So I kind of had a unique experience with, technology. Basically in New York, obviously there's no kind of cul-de-sac where you get to pick your kids up and where there's cars driving. So you kind of have to get thrown out onto the street, and they have the parents pick the kids up from the street. So being out, I guess, when I'm in 4th or 5th grade on a street on my own was kind of, nerve-wracking. So I got a phone at that age just to communicate with my parents as to who's picking me up and who's taking me to whatever activity I have. So I got my phone at an early age. And then I was very lucky to have social media kind of be given to me in little bits and pieces. So I got my first Instagram account maybe like in the middle of 5th grade, and my parents didn't allow me to follow anybody. They only followed me and I only followed them. So they kind of restricted what I saw, and I only had it just to see kind of like, again, what I was, nail art videos and, clay videos, something that's very like, I guess I didn't have a lot of exposure at one time, which I'm very grateful for. I don't think that I would change any of it. And I'm really happy that my parents kind of gave and introduced social media to me in little small chunks and pieces. And I think that that's the best outcome for me, just because I feel like as time goes on and as you mature, you're also ready to, be exposed to certain stuff. And I think that at a young age, I don't think that, it's best for kids to be kind of thrown into the deep end when it comes to social media, because it's such a tricky place to navigate. Yeah.
Hannah, you've got 2 panelists who got their devices younger than my kids did. Was your experience the same? Was it different? And how might you change it looking back?
I think for me, I had gotten my first like real device when I was around, I think it was around like 10 or 9 years old, and it was like an iPad mini. And right away, my parents are kind of like older, so I feel they weren't really strict with social media. They weren't really monitoring my social media intake. And so then that exposed me right deep into all platforms, all social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, anything like that, Tumblr at the time even. And so while that did help me grow into like a creative outlet, that did allow me to be creative through like tutorials and stuff like that, I do think that looking back on it, I do wish that it was a little bit more restrictive, because being exposed to a whole other world uncensored was kind of a learning curve for me as a child. I think you have so many questions as a child. You're so unsure of everything. And so you're taking in all of this information that you know very little about. And while that could have been a very formative learning curve for me, sometimes, unfortunately, it did make me want to question a lot. So I think there's definitely a positive and negative to social media, 100%, even introduced to it as a young child or not. No matter what age you go into it, I do believe that there's a positive and negative always.
Let me pick up there. So this word toxic, Nola, you brought it in. I think it's a really important word. Adults worry about social media. We worry about its impact. Hannah, you're bringing up this interesting thing about there's the impact on young kids. Caleb, you brought up the friction around seeing kids socializing when you were home, and following the rules. Can you give us a little more detail? When you say now, like the toxic now, the times when you're like, this is not good for me, I shouldn't be looking at this. I don't know as an adult who spends a lot of time with teenagers, what is it exactly that you're looking at? What is it that you're seeing? So that's the first question I have and then the second is, what's its impact on you when you're seeing it? Like what happens inside of you? What's your reaction to that? So Nola, why don't we start with you and then we'll go through. Yeah.
So I think I would kind of define toxic on social media. I kind of see it as either when you're getting exposed to kind of like people talking down of other people, or people talking down about yourself, really kind of basic, bad things. And then kind of twisting into more of like a now lens, like a social media lens. I think that especially, body positivity and kind of I guess now social media, it's a place where you can, share your workout routines or share your morning routines and you'll show that you wake up and you're so, whatever. And so I think that now a lot of people compare themselves to other people's situations, whether that be, your body type or your socioeconomic situation or, your education. And so I think that kind of comparing yourself to a person who you see on social media who it probably took 2 years to get where they are, and they don't there's more to the story. And so I think that when you're only getting a 15-second clip, you don't know that what is more to the story. And so I think that there's this kind of sense of comparison that a lot of kids, I know I do, I feel like all kids do, where they kind of compare themselves to these idols that they see on social media. And I think that that's very toxic. And kind of it's kind of a hard balance to figure out what the creators can do to kind of lower this toxic place and whatever toxic environment that their page is fostering to kind of, suppress that. But then also it's partly, the children's responsibility to realize that they shouldn't be comparing themselves to these other people and they shouldn't be feeding into this kind of toxic environment. So I think it's a really hard space to navigate. But I think that comparing yourself to another social media artist is kind of, I think that's how I define toxic in social media.
That's true. Caleb, what are you thinking?
I completely agree. I also think there's an element of asking yourself some really deep questions. For example, recently I had a small group of friends take a trip together to go out of town. And I was thinking, why am I not invited? Why am I not good enough to go on this trip? All those things. And it was difficult to see a lot of my close friends go out of town and have a great time together and post pictures and videos of them having fun. And I was at home, not there with them. And so it was, I describe that as toxic as well, because it just made me feel bad about myself and made me question my relationships with some people. Which I shouldn't have to do. So social media allowed me to see the amazing time my friends were having and how I was not being included in that.
I will say, Cara, don't you look back and think, thank goodness we had no idea all the things we weren't invited to. What a gift that was to be blissfully unaware.
I gotta say, I feel it now as an adult whose brain is fully mature and I understand what's going on. And I think you guys are pretty insightful I feel it now. So I cannot imagine what it's like to go through adolescence with those pressures and with all that knowledge, right? Hannah, how about you? You described sort of having unfettered access. So is your definition of toxicity impacted by that? Is it a little bit different, or is it very much in the same vein?
Well, I believe toxicity in social media, I think, has a lot to do with the audience and their own opinions, and then them obviously sharing that opinion. Sometimes it's hurtful. And not only that, but I think the idea of like spreading false information is a huge way that social media can be very toxic. Misinformation, misguided information, all of that can be harmful. It can be toxic to any platform. And Yeah, I think that's my definition of toxicity in social media. I think it's just the hurtful words as well. Struggling, especially if, a certain person deals with like body image issues or anything like that. I think sometimes it's just the voice of others that is most affected.
I want to pivot the conversation to friendship, but before I do, I just want to make a quick shout out comment to the people who are watching who might have cued into something Caleb said, which is that you can pace what your kids get access to on a device, because just giving someone a device does not mean that you have to give them everything that goes along with the device. And Hannah so articulately described wishing some guardrails had been put up. So I would really encourage anyone who's not sure to empower themselves. And my favorite tip for parents on this one is if you've given too much and you realize it, take a do-over and just claw back a little bit, right? So my guess is, Nola, Caleb, Hannah, if someone had said to you 5 years ago, hey, whoa, this is too much for you right now, and I'm going to take this off your device, you might have pushed back, but my guess is you might have also been grateful inside. So, just take those nods of yes, parents who are watching and people who are involved in the raising of kids as permission to take a do-over, because it's super helpful.
Actually, on those lines, when my now 18-year-old daughter got her first phone, we downloaded a contract from Common Sense Media, and we filled it out together about where it went, what could be on it. All apps had to be approved. So incredible resource that I was using long before I got to know the folks at Common Sense Media. And the other thing I will add is, Caleb, you were talking about how desperately you wanted that device, and kids, when they decide they want it, they really want it. So parents, from a negotiating standpoint, you will never have more power to get that device. Kids will often agree to a pretty restricted use. And I think that is like, you grab as much territory in that moment, because you do lose ground from there. And like Cara said, you can gain some ground back, but start slow, start small. Kids want the device, they will agree to small doses.
We also had a contract. I did not download it from Common Sense Media, and I fully edited it. And my kids are 16 and 18, and we still quote rule number 17 all the time, which is, do not bring your device into the bathroom. Okay, let's shift over a little bit to friendship here. So, we've talked about interacting with people you don't know, and especially in the platform of social media, seeing people who might be strangers to you and just engaging, whether it's from an entertainment standpoint or a knowledge acquisition standpoint. I'm interested in going down the lane of people you do know. So you all spent the better part of the past 2 years, different parts of the country, so different rules. I'm jealous, Hannah, because Lisa and I would speak over the past 2 years, and I know you all were back in school a whole lot sooner than some of the coastal cities, New York and LA in particular. But you all connected with new people in classroom settings, maybe through extracurricular programs, maybe through summer programs. I know my daughter did a summer program at a college and made unbelievable friends on Zoom. Can you all talk about that a little and help it? Because I think it's a lot for us to understand as adults how that works and what those relationships look and feel like. And what advice would you give to parents if their kids are connecting with new kids online?
I had a similar experience. I volunteer with the nonprofit organization Teen Line, which is a teen help hotline where teens are able to chat with other teens about things going on in their lives. And I made some incredible friends volunteering with that program. So I started training in person, and then COVID hit. And so we were forced to go online. And so during shifts, I'd private message people and we'd chat, and I'd follow them on Instagram or get their Snapchat. And that was a great way for me to meet people and to kind of build friendships, because everyone is and was in the same boat of wanting to make connections and wanting to build strong connections with people in a time of social isolation. And then I also did a play on Zoom, which was a great experience, Romeo and Juliet, which was very difficult. But so it was another great opportunity for me to connect with people who shared a similar interest that I did, and made friends off of that as well.
I also think another great way where a lot of teenagers my age have been able to like grow in friendship is also like the breakout rooms. Whenever class would be continuing, teachers would put a lot of students in different breakout rooms, and it would be like a small group just like this one, like around like 4 or 5 people, and you would do projects or you would do anything that was assigned. And I think just having that ability to do that, I think it was just a good way to like strengthen the relationships within people of your class, even if there are people from different classes through different grades. And so, yeah, I think that was definitely a little thing in quarantine that helped like spark relationships for sure.
I didn't make as many friends just during the quarantine, but I did have to maintain a couple long distance friendships. I go to a camp and we usually see each other. It's in South Carolina, so I only get to see them for 2 weeks in South Carolina. And I've created, one of my best friends is there, and I've created so many friendships there. And not being able to go for 2 years because the pandemic was difficult. But I think social media definitely helped when I was, wanted to connect with them. We kind of had calls in our cabin, because we would usually just be doing activities. So I think that social media and or like these social media communication platforms, they have helped me maintain and, create friends. And I'm super grateful for that.
Okay, so Nola, let's pick up there. Walk me through, how do parents get comfortable with that process? Because you can imagine, we didn't grow up with these devices, and this concept is foreign to us. So help a parent understand, how did you actually connect with people and form meaningful connections that it sounds like will last many years to come?
Yes, it's definitely a challenge, just because you don't really fully get, like the full scope of a person just by either texting with them or FaceTiming with them, because there is undoubtedly kind of an aspect of physical presence that rockets friendships, and that's what really gets you to be able to, I guess, understand a person. But I think that making sure that these kids are not getting too overly invested in these friendships, just because sometimes they tend to, I don't want to discourage, kids from making online friendships, but just being mindful of the fact that you're not always going to find your best friend on the internet, because when you're making such, best friend is such a, big word, and it's a big relationship. When you're making these big relationships that'll last a lifetime, the chances of them staying only on a social media platform, the chances of that happening, just from my experience, are like not that as big as, like a physical presence. So I don't think that you should, I guess, as a parent I'm not a parent, but if I were a parent, I don't think that you need to completely limit your child from ever, talking to somebody online or creating friendships online, but making sure that they don't get kind of overly invested in these relationships, and making sure that your kid understands that it's only, I guess, kind of on social media, and there's an aspect of physical presence that makes a relationship, makes a friendship, work, is kind of important.
I'm going to pick up there, because actually we got some questions from parents that are actually right down this line about, and it's sort of two-pronged, but they're very similar. One is, my kids actually become very comfortable at home, and is feeling pretty socially anxious, glad to connect online, but a little nervous about seeing people in person. How do I encourage them to reach out? And a similar question that came in that's very much along these lines is, my kid has made really powerful connections through gaming, has spent a lot of time feeling really, really connected. And I remember saying early on, like first couple of weeks of the pandemic, I'm like, 15-year-old boys are living their best lives right now. Like, they are like absolutely as happy as can be, hanging out with their friends, gaming. Not just 15-year-old boys, but that was sort of like, for what I could tell, the sweet spot. And again, that idea of sort of branching back out into the world. So you guys be the clinicians here. your client is, let's say, a 15 or 16-year-old who's like, I'm pretty comfortable talking to people online. I'm pretty comfortable with my gaming friends. I'm super anxious about going back into an in-person social environment. What advice would you give? Hannah, why don't you kick us off?
I think one of the best advice that I could give that person is just make sure that you're focusing on yourself and what makes you feel comfortable. And if by exposing yourself to little events and talking to like certain people at a small time helps, then completely do it. I think it is definitely nerve-wracking to go fully back into a social setting after being behind the screen for a whole 2 years. And I think gradually exposing yourself is a great way to do that, even if it's just with people you know, or if it's just, close friends, close family, stuff like that, I think is very helpful.
So sort of wade back in. You don't have to do it all at once. I love it.
Right.
Caleb, what advice would you give here?
I mean, to that person, I would say, I get it. I was in the exact same place. I was extremely anxious to go back to school because a lot of these people, most of these people I hadn't seen in person in 2 years. And so it was difficult, and I kind of treated it like I was going to a new school. And so I would go to clubs and go to sporting events. And again, I love doing theater. So I'd participate in plays and take acting classes. And for people who love to video game, making agreements and being like, okay, so if you take this class and in person from this time to this time, then you can come home and chat with your video game friends all you like from this time to this time, or stuff like that. So being able to set boundaries and time limits and stuff like that, I think that's a great way to wade back into old connections and new connections as well.
Love it. Love it. Nola, anything you want to add?
I just wanted to add that I guess in coming out of a pandemic, I feel like I did too. I forgot kind of how to socialize and how to kind of talk to people. And I feel like, especially in the pandemic, it was really easy to kind of lose your personality or your spunk because you're inside for so long. And I think that, for making sure that you're not making sure that your kid is not either like losing their personality or tailoring their personality to some kind of new thing that they want to fit into, because everybody's, coming back, and like people said, you're rushing back to kind of making these big connections, and you want to fit in with this group, and you're invited for this group because you've been inside for 2 years. And so I think that maintaining that personality and that sense of you that was before the pandemic is something that also needs to be happening post-pandemic. And I think that that's kind of something that's, I guess for me, it's really important, just kind of reflecting on making sure that this was my authentic self pre-pandemic as post-pandemic, and that I'm not changing for anybody or to fit into any certain group. Yeah.
And we're talking about a pretty big age group of kids, 8 to 18-year-olds, that Common Sense looked at. And I'm just sort of curious if you all feel like you were slightly protected by your age and maturity in a way that maybe younger kids weren't, and if your advice might be a little different for parents with younger kids, who maybe a kid who left, grade school and showed up and middle school was halfway done and didn't have any of those onboarding experiences. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I definitely think because of the age that we're at now, and because of we essentially grew up with social media, we're definitely more aware on how we use social media and how we utilize it and what our intake is of it. But I think when you're younger, around around age 8, 9, I think it's harder for those kids to have more control over their social media. And with everything, with social media being so easily spread, all of the information, I think it's so easy for them to be exposed to something that probably they shouldn't be exposed to. So I think maybe even like advice for parents for younger kids who are going through this time, going through a mass of social media right now, is to just make a schedule, make a time for them to log off and to have those real world relationships with those friends and get them outside. And I think it's very crucial for that, for sure.
I completely agree, and I was really fortunate to be in 10th grade when the pandemic hit, because I wasn't going to a new school. I wasn't leaving an old school and graduating on Zoom. And I really feel for those kids who started 9th grade or started 6th grade or switched to a new school during the pandemic, because that is so difficult to be able to create new connections without being in person. And so my school had a lot of online events and gatherings for students and new students to come and socialize. And I think a large responsibility of that does go to the school. And so the school should be having those events to get students who are not socializing with people and are having difficulty socializing with people even online, to really focus on those school events, because I think those are super important and really great for students to connect.
Circling back to kind of social media usage, I think that when I again had my Instagram, my parents were able to restrict certain accounts or only allow X, Y, and Z. But I feel like as social media is expanding and the amount of apps that kids use they've expanded massively. I know like Triller and TikTok and Snapchat, like that wasn't around when I first started social media. So kind of managing these different social media platforms I can only imagine it's super difficult for parents, just because when I was a kid, my parents only had to manage one. And so I think that kind of being mindful of the fact that there are so many social media sorry, my dog barked. Being mindful that there are so many social media platforms in this new age of social media, for younger kids, especially because, adding an app to your phone is as easy as, XYZ. So I think that maybe being mindful of the fact that there are so many social media platforms that kids can be using is really, can help a parent kind of decide what platforms they want to give their kids first and what they will and won't allow, because there are different platforms that are used for different things and each have a con and a pro.
Yeah, it's such good advice. Two quick call outs based upon all the things that you've just said. One is that for parents, it can be completely overwhelming to even consider how many platforms there are. Nola, you listed a bunch of them. There are, Discord, which is a chat platform for video gaming. There are just so many, and different kids are on different platforms at different times. Common sense actually dives pretty deep into this. So for parents who are overwhelmed, you can jump on the site and you can begin to understand them. A quick plug for also having conversations with your kids, because if you ask them, maybe they won't tell you the first time, but the more you engage them in the conversation, the more they recognize you care, the more they might be willing to start to talk about how they engage with people. And so I think that's a really good piece. The other thing that came up a little bit earlier was in this thread was about mental health in general. And, I'm lucky to be joined on this panel by Lisa, who is, truly one of the great mental health minds out there. And for those of you who haven't read her work, just run and start reading. She's incredible. But I'm just going to be the one to do the plug for if you need help or your kid needs help, get some help. There are lots of resources. They begin at your school, at your primary healthcare provider's office. Caleb mentioned Teen Line is an incredible resource for kids. There are so many resources out there. And I think one thing that we've learned in the pandemic was some of the statistics that have been reported about mental health that are just staggering. I think one thing we've all learned is there's no shame in recognizing that you need a little bit of extra support and guidance for both parents and kids. So I'm just going to do that plug. Before we let our panelists go, I thought maybe we could just wrap with a quick comment from each of you about there's, in real life, friendships are incredibly important for a lot of reasons. because the vulnerability of being in real life and face to face with someone is incredibly important. Feeling seen is incredibly important. Can you each maybe leave with a pearl for the people who are listening about either what value and virtual friendship has for you, or a pearl about transitioning back and forth between virtual and in real life friendships that you might think would be helpful for the people who are listening? Caleb, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think what I'll end on is the pandemic has been really difficult for teens everywhere. And social media has really helped me stay in contact with people and to continue to build and further develop connections. And now that restrictions are getting looser and tighter and looser, keeping those friendships to being able to keep those friendships in person and trying to see people in person is extremely important. And it really, 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 really changed my mental health when I was starting to be able to see people again. And also setting healthy boundaries with people online is also really important. So that's what I'll end on.
Hannah, go for it.
I think I wanted to end on the fact that social media and in-person relationships are two completely different things. I think you can completely change who you are on social media, but you can't. It's kind of hard to change yourself when you're in person. And I think reminding people to stay who you truly are in real person and to be more vulnerable is a huge risk that people are willing to take, but at the end it could be so worth it. So I think, and not only that, but I think social media has created so many opportunities for people through connection, through news, through new information, and I hope that the parents will know that through the knowledge and the hope from their kids that social media is a positive thing and that it can be beneficial for them.
Social media has kind of helped me maintain and curate friendships. As I mentioned before, I have some long distance friendships and I haven't been able to see them. So I'm really grateful that these sort of platforms help me, commit and stay friends with people. And I think that, but there's nothing like seeing them in person and having face-to-face contact is just absolutely unmatched, and it's a magical thing, and it's hard to get that on social media. And so kind of understanding the balance, because communication nowadays in sort of like a teen sense, kind of between your peers and between your friends, kind of thrives on social media, whether that be like Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok, and people communicate towards that. So not making sure that you're not completely cutting off your child from, the, social media world, which is how we as teens communicate now is kind of important. But then also finding that balance and understanding that too much social media is definitely not good for a kid. And I've had to take, as I grow up and as I mature, I kind of recognize that I have to take the responsibility for breaking social media off for some parts of my day and kind of just making sure that there's a human aspect to me, and making sure that I'm still who I am with or without social media. And I just think that's important. And so I'm grateful for social media, but I also think that maintaining kind of a relationship with it where I'm not too active on it, but I'm also not completely isolating myself from the social media world has been important for me to navigate, and has been, a part of, I guess, my growth for me to navigate. Yeah.
Wow. We cannot thank you enough for how generous you have been with yourselves and your wisdom and your experience. You brought information to this conversation that Cara and I, for all we know about teenagers, could never have brought forward. What I am hearing, and Cara and I will debrief a little bit more, is just how important it has been, and yet how much social media needs to be kept in balance with being together and being real and being who you truly are in a 3D way with your peers. But thank you so much. We really cannot thank you enough for what you've given us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. Have a wonderful night, you guys. And then Cara, you and I will let's think this through together here.
Yeah, let's stay on for a couple of extra minutes. And I should disclose, I probably should have said this at the top. Lisa is my pandemic virtual friendship.
Yes.
We literally live this topic in real life. We have known each other a little bit professionally, but when the pandemic hit is when we became friends, and it is not an in real life, in person friendship, but is one of the deeper friendships in my life. And so everything that you are hearing, I think we all as adults experience. And my guess is that as people are listening to that, they have plenty of either people in their life who are new or reconnections that they've made during the pandemic that have been so deep and meaningful. And but I think it might be helpful for us to debrief for a second and to help parents and educators think through a little bit, what do we do with the information that has been shared, and how do we help kids as we're figuring this out ourselves? Do you want to take a stab at it?
I do, and I also just want to say, I mean, it's been like this. Yes, you've been my gift in the pandemic, and to watch you do the thinking around the medical piece, the biological piece, the developmental piece, and to integrate it and all together is just an incredible thing. But, when I was thinking about what those extraordinary young people were telling us, that they are all plugged into their social media worlds. They all have, you brought up this incredible point about they came into this actually on the back end of adolescence, which was probably an enormous advantage to them. So they've got perspective. They're able to sort of take a long view. They're self-regulating on it. We got a question though, and Cara, I want to see what you think on this. I think this is a really tricky one, but we got a question from a parent about what about a kid who's actually not that plugged in online, especially in the pandemic, much less engaged than other kids. Parents who are worried, they're not so much with their peers in real life. They're not that plugged in terms of social media. Maybe a child who's quite introverted or maybe bends towards being somewhat of a loner. How do we want to think about those young people? Because as much as those, as our fabulous teenagers are talking about, social media is complicated. It's got a lot of, dark corners. Their parents, I don't think, spent a lot of time worrying that their kid was not a part of things. So what do you think of the kid who's not engaged?
Yeah, and I'll add another layer to the question, which is there's such a sort of jujitsu moment where, at least in pediatrics, we've been saying, as long as I've been a pediatrician, here are all the downsides to being too plugged in. Here are all the reasons to slow it down as much as you can. And for people who followed the advice to the letter, they were caught flat-footed at the beginning of the pandemic because their kids actually maybe didn't have the connections or the skills, and then layer on that the kids who aren't inclined that way. And so I'll answer sort of from the pediatric standpoint. I would love you to answer from the mental health standpoint. But, from the pediatric standpoint, what we know to be so true is that friendship is critical. It really is critical, but you only need one.
Yep.
And I think that's, it's the hardest piece of advice we give, because one feels lonely and scary and vulnerable, and you can lose that one. But any parent who has a child who's truly isolated will see that it's the one that matters. And some kids are not best friend oriented, but usually the kids who are very isolated, they do connect better just with them. And so what I would say to those parents is feed and water that one. And, in my own home, we are entering year 3 in pandemic. I have felt my the bow of my ship turning in terms of how I encourage my kids to connect with other kids now, that especially for vaccinated, and if you're booster eligible, boosted people, being social with caution is much safer now. And so I think we've got to let them have if they're that kid, we've got to let them have their one and send them out. What do you say?
So 100%. For me, there's a great opinion between a child who has no friends and a child who has one good friend. Two good friends is also good. But I think that, we see this consistently in the research. The happiest kids have one or two good friends. It's not these large social groups. Those are pretty stressful for kids. So in terms of a kid going from 0, they don't have to go to 4. They need to go to 1, maybe 2. Then the question is, if your kid hasn't found that one, how do you find the one? And one of the rules I live by as a psychologist is you don't make friends, you find friends. That it's a chemistry issue to find the kid who's going to be your buddy. And so if you have a young person, if your child is looking for friends, you can't say, well, why don't you go talk to the neighbor? It just may not be the right kid. So the way we want to think about it is try to get a lot of kids into your child's traffic pattern. Have them join a team, have them go to a club, have them be out and about, with the idea that in having a lot of access to a lot of different kids, you up the odds they're going to find the person who's going to be their person. And this gets, of course, then to the safety issues, right? Of being on a team and being a part of things. And I think for me, the most heartbreaking aspect of the pandemic is that we are trading medical health against mental health, and we're having to sit in that tension. And I will say now, given that there is a great deal that can be done to protect medical health, I, as a psychologist, am going to say it's now time to try to favor mental health as much as we can.
Oh, 1,000%.
Right.
The medical world is so behind that statement because the balance has shifted. There is no question. And I would just add one little asterisk caveat about the one friend, which is, parents, you are not the friend. That it's the rare kid for whom that is what does it. So do prioritize their mental health and send them off. And if you're looking at weighing risks and benefits, let them have the social interaction. You can hold back for a little bit longer. You can, it's some of this is how big you make the denominator, right? So maybe you restrict your social interactions and put your kids first. So I want to invite Lisa Solomon back in for a second before we say goodbye. Thank you, Lisa, for organizing this and for getting this unbelievable panel.
Yes, thank you for having us. What an honor to be invited.
What an honor to listen. I could sit here all night, and I'm just going to come over and hang out with you guys when this is over, because I can't wait till we're back in real life. So thank you for your pearls of wisdom. I want to also thank the teens who are just extraordinary and added such an interesting layer on top. So thank you for your time. And I also want to thank all of you out there that are watching. It says so much that you're taking the time to spend investing in your kids and understanding where they're playing online and offline. So I thank you for that. I hope we've given you some pearls of wisdom to consider, even if it's just one or two, as you move into the rest of your evening and your day. And we also hope that you will consult with Common Sense Media for all of our free resources and answers about raising kids in today's media-rich world. We do have a free newsletter that I also encourage you to sign up for. You can put how old your kids are and get information according to their age and stage. And if you're so moved, feel free to also donate while you're signing up for the newsletter to our nonprofit. Most importantly, I just wanted to thank Cara and Lisa and our teenagers, and thank you all for joining us. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, and let us know if you have any questions or feedback. Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Jordan, are we done?